So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on transport and low carbon pathways. Of course, this is a very relevant and timely discussion. We know that transport contributes about 25 or 23% of all energy-related emissions, and therefore the sector plays a very relevant role in climate change mitigation. So finding a commonly acceptable pathway to achieve a zero transport emissions by 2050 is a very notable goal. And while COP21 has created a political environment, an enabling environment, and a roadmap for national decarbonization commitments, the future is still uncertain. So central to this agenda and the topic of this discussion today is what are the policies that could be put in place to help reaching this goal, and particularly those that will support unleashing the technology and innovation deployments that are needed for achieving these significant greenhouse gas emission reductions in the transport sector. So we know, and we will hear today, I'm sure, that while many countries, states, and localities around the world are using and planning to use carbon pricing policies as a means to reducing greenhouse emissions, for several reasons, for the transport sector, these may not be enough, as the transport sector may not be as responsible for economy-wide carbon pricing as for example, in the electricity sector. So targeted policies are needed to complement carbon pricing where market impediments prevent people from adequately responding to these carbon pricing signals. So the use of policies that push technological advancements, for example, the use of vehicle standards that will spur manufacturers to drive down emissions intensity and produce cleaner vehicles, or lower the cost or the duration of or the range of vehicles, electric vehicles, in combination with approaches that create a demand pool for cleaner technologies through carbon pricing, or those that reduce the load of the transport system altogether, no? So reducing the average trip lengths, or promoting modal shifts and shared mobility, or rethinking the way communities are designed and land use is planned. All of these are important for ensuring that the transport sector will have the tools available to reach these aggressive mid-century climate goals. So we are about to hear from three experts who are going to present their research work contributing to this policy discussion to decarbonize the transport sector. So please join me in welcoming our panel members. And we have Meriem Hamdi-Cherif, a research fellow of the International Research Center on Environment and Development, CIRED, and an expert in long-term modeling assessment of the transition to low-carbon economies, particularly in developing countries. In her research that we are going to listen today, she looks at the effects on decarbonization from voluntary transport policies in China aimed at reducing mobility. Next to her, we have Dr. James Seong-Cheol Kang, James, who is a principal transport specialist of the Global Green Growth Institute, who leads technical research and policy advisory work on transport. So James' work looks into the economic feasibility of introducing a policy to gradually transition from LPG taxis to electric vehicle ones based on his work in Seoul. And last but not least, we have Vivien Fisch Fornito, a PhD candidate in environmental economics at CIRED, whose current research focuses on the role of infrastructure to provide basic services along low-carbon paths. So the bios for the three panelists are available at the GGKP web platform, so if anyone is interested, I will encourage you to look at there. And each of them will have 15 minutes to present their main conclusions of their work and their research. And then at the end, we have, as a discussant from the session, Shomik Mehndiratta, who is a practice manager in the Transport and ICT Global Practice in the Latin American region, but also currently is our lead for the community of practice of green transport. So he will have 10 minutes at the end to sort of discuss what we have heard from these three presentations. Normally, I will only open for questions at the end once we have heard from the three panelists and the discussant, and we will have a 25-minute, more or less, to keep this us on time and finish at 1. So without further ado, maybe let me invite Meriem to take the stage and present us with her work.
Yeah, I need some help because I don't know how to. Yeah. It's okay. And then just I press F something there.
No, you're already there. You're already there. You just need to do the full screen thing.
Yeah.
I think it's this one, no?
No. Yeah. Great. More or less. Okay. So, good morning, everybody. I'm going to try to present quite quickly a paper entitled "The Transportation Sector as a Lever for Reducing Long-Term Mitigation Costs in China." Oh, no. It's not the good way to, because if I want to change, it's okay. Sorry. First, just to put things into context, let me remind that the Chinese economic development goes actually hand in hand with first a growth of the production. Thank you. A growth of the production, which is actually accompanied with an increase of the freight transportation and an enriched population and a fast-growing urbanization that induce an increasing demand, in particular for passenger transportation. So given the high reliance of China and the transportation sector, in particular on oil products, and the increasing energy demand and increasing CO2 emissions, the transportation sector is quite crucial for China, particularly regarding the two issues of energy security and climate change. So in its attempt to have a sustainable development, the transportation sector is particularly challenging for China, especially given the high coal availability and the important lifespan of infrastructure. China has to redouble its efforts, in particular to avoid important lock-ins in carbon-intensive pathways. So the purpose of this study and this paper is to try to investigate the role of transportation, in particular passenger and freight transportation activities in the transition to the low-carbon economy in China. It's an attempt to quantify the impact of some urban voluntary policies on Chinese mitigation costs, and the particular attention will be given to specific measures that are designed to control the growth of mobility. To do so, we have used an energy economy environment so-called E3 model that allows an explicit representation of the interplay between the transport, energy, and growth patterns. I'm not going to enter into the details of the description of the model, don't worry. Just a few important features that are it's a hybrid general equilibrium model, and it's hybrid in that sense that it relies on hybrid matrices that ensure a consistency between money flows and physical quantities, which means for transportation sector in particular that we have passenger kilometers and ton kilometers. So in addition, and I'll be very fast about that, don't worry, in addition to the standard representation of the transportation technologies, we have, this representation is supplemented by an explicit representation of the behavioral determinants of mobility. So very quickly, just let me say that each representative household maximize each regional representative household, so Chinese households in particular, when they maximize their utility provided by the consumption of goods and services. Among the services, you have the transportation services. So they maximize it under twofold constraints. In addition to the standard budget constraint, we have a travel time budget constraint. So this representation allows in particular to have a representation of the rebound, to represent the rebound effect of energy efficiency improvement on mobility, endogenous mode choices in relation with the infrastructure availability and the impact of investment in infrastructure capacity on the amount of travel, so on the mobility. And finally, also to represent the constraints imposed on mobility needs by firms and households location. So it's a way, a certain way to represent urban forms. To assess the effect of mobility control measures in China, we have designed three contrasted scenarios. One reference scenario called business as usual, where no climate policy is implemented at all. A second, which will be taken as a benchmark. A second scenario where we have a quite stringent climate objective that correspond to a 3.4 watt per meter square in 2100, and that is satisfied by a carbon price only policy. And then a third scenario where we have the same climate objective that is complemented, that is achieved by using a carbon pricing policy, but this carbon price is complemented by urban organization policies that aim at controlling the behavioral determinant of the mobility demand. More specifically, precisely, what we have designed is a urban reorganization that allows for a lowering of the mobility for commuting and shopping, a reallocation of infrastructure investments in favor of public transportation modes, and finally, adjustments of the logistic organizations that allows to decrease, for decreasing the transportation intensity of production and distribution processes. In terms of results, what we have obtained is that despite, I don't know how am I in terms of time. Okay. So in terms of the whole emission of the transportation sector, we find that emission decrease in the second half of the century, whatever the scenario, which is due to the population. But despite the decrease, emission from the transport represent a significant, we observe that emission from transport represent a significant part of remaining emissions. And we already observe the effects of the mobility control measures, since we observe that emissions in the second climate policy scenario, the S2, are lower during the whole century. When we look at what happens in terms of passenger transportation dynamics, we observe that wherever the scenario considered and whatever the transportation mode, emissions increase significantly in the second half of the century. But we observe that while they remain above the 2010 level in the reference benchmark scenario, they are significantly lower in the stabilization scenario, and this effect is particularly notable in the S2 scenario. So in order to understand what are the mechanisms at play, we decompose the mechanism and we look at the evolution of the total passenger mobility per capita, the modal breakdown, the evolution of the modal breakdown, and we look also at the efficiency improvement of the vehicle fleet. When we look at what happens in terms of passenger transport evolution, we observe a rapid increase of mobility in the baseline scenario, and this rapid increase is only moderately affected by the mitigation policy, when the carbon price is the only instrument that is used to achieve the climate policy. This can be explained by the fact that the climate policy using carbon price induce a lowering of oil and coal demand, which induce a limitation of the increase of fuel costs. And also we have a second point is that is the strong inertia of urban organizations that also play an important role. And And the mobility in S2, we observe on the other hand that the mobility in S2 is significantly lower, and this is due to measures that favor the moderation of the urban sprawl. When we look now at the model breakdown in passenger transport, we observe that the scenario of the carbon price only policy and the benchmark scenario, the business as usual one, are quite similar, which can be explained again by the carbon price that induce a lowering of the fossil fuel prices, partially offset the carbon price that induce a lowering of oil and coal prices, induce an offset of the increase of the fossil fuel costs, which induce the fact that motorized mode become more accessible. And then we have an investment in road infrastructures, which decrease the road congestion and in turn favors the attractiveness of private cars at the expense of the other transportation modes. But with specific measures that trigger a redirection of investments in favor of low carbon transportation infrastructures, we observe a significant shift from personal vehicles to public and non-motorized mode. Finally, when we look at liquid fuel consumption of the Chinese personal vehicle fleet per passenger kilometer, in order to capture in particular the efficiency improvement of internal combustion engines and also the electrification of the fleet through the division of hybrid and electric vehicles, we observe that in the scenario where we have only a carbon price instrument, this carbon price allows for significant vehicle efficiency improvement with respect to the business as usual scenario. And this effect is very lowered in the S2 scenario due to the fact that we have lower carbon prices in this scenario, and we have also a slower fleet turnover due to the lower vehicle use. So to sum up, what we can say is that we observe very different determinants of emission reduction in passenger transportation according to the implemented policies. If the carbon price is the only instrument, so the major effect comes from the diffusion of energy efficiency in vehicles, while when complementary policies are implemented, modal shifts towards low carbon modes coupled with mobility reduction measures play a dominant role. I'm not going to talk at all about what happens in freight transportation. You can trust me about the fact that the results are quite similar, and you can find the results in the paper. Very quickly, I just want to highlight the fact also about the finding we found in this study that without specific measures aimed at reducing mobility, decarbonization efforts in China are mainly based on electricity and industry. But with transportation policies, we find that they increase the contribution of the transportation sector for mitigation efforts, which allow the other main emitting sector to slow their decarbonization effort. Finally, in terms of macroeconomic effects, given the very weak sensitivity of the transportation sector to price signals, we have a need for very high CO2 price during the second half of the century to reach the climate objective, which induces significant macroeconomic effect in terms of cost if the CO2 price is the only instrument. But if we implement mobility growth control measures, they offer mitigation potentials that are independent from price instruments and carbon price in particular. They allow for important reductions in terms of the level of the carbon price that is needed to reach the climate objective, and they induce significant reduction of the macroeconomic mitigation costs. So in conclusion, what I can say is that this study allows us to highlight the role of the transportation sector in the mitigation process, in particular in a country like China. And given a climate objective, the implementation of measures that allow to foster a modal shift toward low carbon modes, in addition to a decoupling of mobility needs from economic activity, prove to first modifying the sectoral distribution of mitigation efforts, contribute to avoid the risk of lock-ins in carbon-intensive pathways, and significantly reduce the mitigation macroeconomic costs relatively to a situation where the carbon price is the only instrument that is used. So the idea here is to say that early and voluntary infrastructure policies have a key role to play as a hedge against the risk of very high costs of a climate stabilization that China seems to undertake. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. This is one of the perspectives of additional policies that could complement carbon pricing. So this one comes from the side of mobility control. And now, from a little bit of a different perspective, we're going to hear from James in terms of changing or using more clean technologies. No, so James, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Maria. And good morning. I don't know whether it's good afternoon. It's almost noon. So we are just in between. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to just talk about, one of the case studies that, we'll look at, in terms of the green and sustainable transport, especially focusing on, taxis in Seoul, Korea. Now, in the morning, we heard that the transport sector is one of the main economic sectors in terms of the greenhouse gas emission. Depending on the statistics, it may produce 20% of the energy-related emissions. IPCC data, shows that, 14%. Anyway, it's a major, greenhouse gas emitters. And if you look at the developing countries, urbanization is happening very rapidly, and motorization is very strong. So there are many problems, in the transport sector. And if you look at the Paris Agreement, in order to meet the 2 degrees Celsius or even 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, each sector has to take, very significant, steps, to reduce greenhouse gas emission reduction. And in the transport community, we also believe that, deep decarbonization is needed, in order to actually closely meet this 2 degree Celsius goal of the Paris climate agreement. So in what way actually we can achieve, such kind of ambitious goal? There can be many. And one of the sort of the clear policy direction is the electrification of the transportation mode. And of course, promoting public transportation and, non-motorized transportation as well. So in terms of the electrification of transportation sector, electric vehicle has been, around, for many years. And, it has been considered as the one of the most effective, the policy intervention in terms of the air pollution reductions as well as greenhouse gas emission reductions. However, if you look at the global situation, in terms of this diffusion of electric vehicles, my personal view is that it has been disappointing. Of course, these days, situation is getting a little bit better. It's mainly because of the strong policy intervention from the government. France and UK announced that, they will ban, the fossil fuel, vehicles from 2040. And this morning we heard that in Jordan, the sort of the fleet, 70% of the fleet, will be electric vehicle or at least hybrid because they are abolishing all these, import taxes. And, I'm very pleased to hear, that kind of policy intervention because, GGGI is working in Jordan, transport sector area, very strongly these days. So, we thought about why this deployment of the electric vehicles has been so disappointing. The barriers are some of the barriers are obvious. The prices of the electric vehicles have been high compared to the this comparable internal combustion engine vehicles, and there are some inconvenience associated with the running electric vehicles. Mainly charging times is longer, and then there are not many charging stations that you can use. And the another kind of the factor is that people are not familiar with these electric vehicles. They heard a lot from the media and from the commercials, but actually not many people actually using the electric vehicles around you. So you don't really know what kind of sort of the situation experience you'll be getting. But there are many opportunities actually we can also think about in terms of electric vehicle deployment. First of all, the price of electric vehicles is going down very rapidly, mainly because of the cost of batteries is going down rapidly. And then there's also the technological advancement in terms of the charging times and so on. These days the fast charging technology requires only 30 minutes. Still, it's a long time, to charge your battery in your car up to 80%. But still, oops, I didn't do anything. Okay, but still, it's kind of difficult, for government, to, force, general public, these people, individuals, to buy electric vehicles in favor of the environmental, impact. So what we think about is, are there any, subsectors or transport services where, government, may actually influence, this policy of, adapting electric vehicles through certain policy mandate or, even some kind of incentives. So we thought about actually taxi industry and rental car industries, because in order to actually operate to that kind of business, you need the permissions from the government and so on and so forth. So we focused on this taxi industry, in particular, because there are certain characteristics that we can actually think of, from the taxi operation, because if you look at the taxis, their driving distance, every day is way longer than the private vehicle. And then, there also has a long idling time. If there is no customers, they just, maybe, sitting down, on the side of the road and just, idling, their engines, which means that there's a lot of the emissions of the air pollutant and greenhouse gases. And if you look at the Seoul in Korea, we have this pilot project since 2015, having these 6 electric vehicle taxis, around the city. But it's too small, too few, for people to notice. So, what we thought is, what we think about is, if we actually sort of introduce electric vehicles in the taxi industry, side first, then, it'll have some kind of the public awareness, the impact as well. Because, taxis, are being noticed, quite easily on the street. So people, take a taxis and just realize, okay, it's very convenient and it's very environmentally friendly. And it may actually affect, people's behavior in terms of, purchasing, next vehicle, for them. So here's a little of the characteristics of the taxi transport in Seoul. It only comprised 2.4% of total registered vehicles. So it's about 72,000 vehicles. So it's a very small percentage. However, in terms of the mode share, the calculated number of trips is 6.8%. So, with very small, the fleet size, actually, it covers a lot of, passengers. And the travel distance per day is 226 kilometers. Compared to that, the private passenger vehicle, on average, it travels 30 kilometers. So there's a big difference in terms of, driving distance. And then, by law, the private taxis can operate up to 9 years. And after that, it has to be decommissioned and replaced by, new taxis. And the company taxis has a shorter operational lifetime because, they operate more. And if you look at the graph on the right side, it shows actually the per car, the emission amount. So we compare the taxi and private cars, and then, how much the air pollutant and, the greenhouse gas emissions are emitted. And as you can see, the taxi actually emits disproportionately much higher emissions of the air pollutant and greenhouse gases. So if we actually change the taxes, it will have the, great impact, per vehicle, for the environment. So the exact problem, we considered is that we gradually replace the current fleet of the taxis, in Seoul, which uses liquefied, petroleum gas, LPG, based on the operational lifetime. So when a taxi reaches the operational lifetime, is usually 7 to 9 years. When we assume actually 7 years, then it has to be decommissioned, and then we assume that it is replaced by electric vehicle taxis. So we then conducted the benefit cost analysis in order to look at the society as a whole benefit and cost situation. This table shows the sort of the summary of the different cost and benefit elements, considered in the benefit cost analysis for different countries. The reason actually I'm showing this table is because the Korea actually is kind of conservative, in terms of this benefit cost analysis, because, we don't take many benefits, when we conduct the benefit cost analysis. So here are the specific cost element and benefit elements, we considered in this study. And the first cost element is purchasing vehicles. So there should be additional cost, for purchasing, electric vehicles. So the difference, in prices between the LPG taxi and electric vehicle taxis, should be, accounted for. So this is, straightforward. Now, second cost element is the charging infrastructure provision. In order to actually estimate how many charging stations we need and what is the cost associated with the charging station provision, actually we go through, 3 steps. The first, we estimate the total daily charging demand. So how many times actually we need to, we actually anticipate, the taxis, should be charged. So, based on the current research, we believe, we have the statistic 2.96 times per day is the daily charging frequency. So if we multiply that statistic with the total EV taxis in operation, we can actually have the total daily charging demand. Now, then the second step is, because, the taxis operate, in different ways, so not all of them actually go to the charging station, to recharge at the same time. They will be distributed. So, we consider the peak hour demand. So, according to the existing study, there will be about 11% is the peak hour demand. It's the 1 and 2 a.m. on Friday. So there's a sort of the, there's time that actually the taxi demand is the peak. So, by multiplying this, peak hour demand, we can obtain maximum hourly charging demand. And then the third step is, how many charging stations needed. In current market analysis, we found that in Korea, the mandate is 1 charging station. The single charging station should have the 3 charging cables. So you can actually charge 3 cars simultaneously. So, and it takes 30 minutes, using the fast charging, technology. So, by dividing, the maximum hourly charging demand, by, this hourly charging capacity, we'll get how many charging stations, we need. And finally, we have the cost, number for construction and the maintenance cost. And then, we calculate this yearly cost for charging station construction and maintenance. quickly, the benefit side. The first benefit side is environmental improvement, because we can expect the reduction in air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions. We can have the monetary benefits. So it has the 3 steps. The first one is traffic assignment and calibration of parameters. And second step is we calculate the avoided air pollutant and greenhouse emissions. And last step is monetization of that avoided emissions. The first step is something called the traffic assignment. In the next slide, I will show the something called the emission factor. Emission factor means that how much emissions are coming out of the car based on the travel speed. So in order to actually estimate the emission amount, we need to estimate the vehicle speed. Now, usually the analysis use the average vehicle speed in the city, which is quite sort of the rough estimate. So to avoid that very rough calculation and to obtain more correct, quote unquote, the estimated this avoided emission, we use the methodology called traffic assignment. It is very standard and well-known methodology in transport planning. The model, and then we use the network of Seoul, and then this database of the traffic demand in order to conduct this assignment. And this is what I just said, the emission factor. The emission factor is the amount of emission as a function of the vehicle speed. So it has a different formula for different type of the air pollutant and greenhouse gases. So we have the CO, carbon monoxide, and nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. And it also have the different formula for different it's age of the vehicle. So it's like old vehicle, of course, has the more emissions. So using this formula, and then getting the vehicle speed from this traffic assignment step, we can actually calculate the emission amount. So this is the emission amount for different years, based on the number of LPG taxis on the streets. So because we can expect the reduction in air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions, we can actually calculate the benefits by monetizing the reduced amount. In order to monetize the avoided emissions, we need something called social cost of the air pollutant and greenhouse gas emissions. And the social cost that we use is from the Korea Development Institute. Is again, by law, we are required to use, this statistics, this number, whenever we do the benefit cost analysis. So, for example, 1 kilogram avoided emission of, carbon monoxide, the monetary value is $8.81, and so on and so forth. So, based on the social cost, we can calculate this avoided cost. And the operating cost reductions. Here, actually, we just consider the savings from fuel change. So, the LPG taxis use liquefied petroleum gases, and then electric vehicle obviously use electricity. So we compare the current the fuel efficiency, how many kilometers, how long actually the cars can travel per liter or per kilowatt hour, and what is the current price, for this LPG and electricity. And based on that, this table shows the, the savings from the switching, from the LPG to electricity. So putting all together, we have the benefit cost ratio of the 1.46. So, just roughly speaking, we can say that the gradual replacement of the current fleet of the LPG taxis with the electric vehicle taxis can be economically, viable. And this BC ratio could be even higher if we consider the declining battery cost, and then, it's like shortening the charging times. To conclude, is again, I'm just repeating myself, to achieve the Paris Agreement, these goals of the 2 degrees Celsius, so 1.5, the transport system needs to be transformed, more greener and sustainable systems. And just one very small step toward this goal is to, maybe change this fossil fuel-based the taxi industry, with electric, more environmentally friendly electric vehicle taxis. And so if the policymakers, implement this kind of the policy first, then, it'll have some impact on the general public. They will see the benefits of electric vehicle. And, we believe that, maybe it will contribute to the more sort of scale up, deployment of electric vehicles, in a country or in a cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. So another very interesting perspective, and maybe then we can, when we open the discussion, taxis is one possibility, but then more generally public transport and buses electrification, no? So maybe when we discuss this could be another topic. And then for our last panel member, we have Vivien, who's going to talk us a little bit about a different side, which is from the infrastructure side, no, and the investment needs and how this low carbon path infrastructure could also contribute to the goals.
There are buttons that I have to, because my presentation is on the screen and not, oh no, it's okay, sorry. Hello, so I'm going to show you in this presentation how investment needs in transport infrastructures could differ with the implementation of climate policies. So first of all, higher freight and passenger activity are expected because of population and economic growth, especially in developing countries. And so in order to balance this mobility demand, we have to increase the stocks of infrastructures and improve the quality of those infrastructures. But on the other side, the sector is highly oil dependent and represents an important share of total CO2 emissions. So mitigation is necessary in this sector. And infrastructures have an important role to play. First of all, inducing modal shift from high carbon modes to lower carbon modes. And secondly, because of long lifetime, the transport infrastructures can lock in transport partners to high emitting modes. So transport infrastructure basically is at the intersection between climate and development issues. But needs of investments are not necessarily fulfilled, as you can see on this slide, in developed and developing countries. And we want to know if this tension is going to be exacerbated or released by the implementation of climate policies. So our research questions: what are the impact of climate policies? Is there any heterogeneity between world regions? And what are the levers, the policy levers, that we can use in order to avoid the high cost pathways? So our geographical scope will be global and regional, and we use a long time horizon of with the year 2080. And we present our results in cumulative terms and relative to GDP in order to be able to compare the needs of investments between regions and with historical data. We considered the construction costs, the operational and the maintenance costs in order to not underestimate the investment needs. And we want to take into account the robustness of results with scenarios analysis. And we do a sensitivity analysis in order to analyze the policy levels and the main determinants of costs. So our methodology is in two steps. First of all, we build socio-economic scenarios from where we get transport activity trajectory from an integrated assessment model. And secondly, we quantified the investment needs that are coherent with those transport activity trajectory. So I'm not going to be very long on this model because Meriem has already presented it, but just to add something on the freight sector, in the model, the freight sector is considered as an intermediary consumption by the other sectors. And this representation of the transportation sector allows us to represent two stylized facts: the shift to faster modes when revenue increased, and the rebound effect in case of high energy efficiency. So we want to explore uncertainties that have influence on transport activities. So as you can see, we explore the growth drivers that we calibrate on the shared socioeconomic pathways, the mitigation challenges, are they going to be low or high in the future worlds, the transport activity, where we represent a past trend of urban sprawl or a decrease of mobility needs, the transport structure, which can be individual or more share mobility oriented, the transport intensity with the energy efficiency in the transport sector, and the availability of biofuels. So we combine all these alternatives in order to build baseline scenarios, and we test on those scenarios 2 climate policies, a low mitigation ambitions, which correspond to the RCP 4.5, and a high mitigation ambitions policy, which correspond to which is close to a 2-degree target, basically. And for the second step, we take the scenarios from EMACLIM, and we first of all disaggregate the mobility scenarios for the public transport modes in the 4 different modes, and for the land freight we do a disaggregation as well based on historical data for each region. Then we aggregate the different mobility, the different modes on different infrastructures. So we need the stocks of infrastructures, of the different infrastructures in each region. And then we calculate the needs of infrastructure. That's a methodology inspired by Dulac. So basically, we want to reach a target of infrastructure occupancy on the long term, and the model calculates each year the difference between an existing stock and a necessary stock in order to reach the occupancy that we want to reach. So it leads to new builds of infrastructures or an increase of infrastructure occupancy. And we add constraints on infrastructure's density for rail and road in order to represent the different geographical constraints in the different regions. And then the model calculates the associated costs. Again, there are uncertainties on the second step of our model. So the mode shares for land freight and public transport can be constant based on historical values, or we assume a mode shift from road to rail. The target of road occupancy, we find high heterogeneity between regions in the literature and in our model calibration. So we assume that values, as initial values in India and China can't be considered as a future target because of expected surge of personal vehicle use. And the others uncertainties that we considered, as we can see, the road unit cost evolutions and the rail unit cost evolutions. So our results, that's a comparison for each investment trajectory between baselines and climate policies implementation. So when it's negative, it's a decrease of investment needs. And as you can see on the left side, that's the global scale. For the 2 climate policies, investments tend to decrease, and so we confirm this result from the literature, and this result is robust to uncertainties that we have considered. And we found as well that this result is valid at the regional scale for the 5 regions: Asia, Middle East and Africa, CIS, which is basically the former Soviet Union, Latin America and OECD. So this result is valid as well for the regional scale, and most of this reduction come from road investment needs reduction, which represent more than 50% of total reduction. And this reduction is mainly driven by a reduction of transport activity with climate policy implementation, and a mode shift from road modes to non-travel modes, non-motorized mode. But even if investments tend to decrease with the implementation of climate policies, it still be a challenge. So this is the regional investments and the high mitigation ambitions, so scenarios. So it's a target close to 2 degrees. And as you can see, so it's in a share of GDP. Investment needs tend to be higher in the region CIS and Middle East and Africa, and with high uncertainties on the values for those same regions. So in order to avoid those high investment needs compared to historical values, because most of the countries tend to invest a maximum of 3% of GDPs for the last 20 years. So invest something like 5% of GDP could be unrealistic or very hard to do. So in order to analyze the different levers that we can use in order to avoid high investment needs, so basically we do a global sensitivity analysis, and just the red circle, the size of the circle represents the contribution of each determinant to the total variance of results. And as you can see, so the green circle is the rail occupancy, and the blue circle are the evolution of road costs. And those two parameters in a model are determinants for all the regions. Of the graphical? So basically, it's a global sensitivity analysis for each region. So we analyze the contribution of each uncertainty to the total results uncertainties. And as you can see, the rail target and the road cost influence the results in all regions. The rail occupancy, sorry. It's urban and non-urban. So basically, it's a number of passenger kilometers and ton kilometers on each track kilometers. And so there is two possible interpretation. For example, in CIS and LAM, the rail occupancy, the initial rail occupancy for former Soviet Union was really high compared to other countries. And for Latin America, the rail occupancy was really low. So it seems unrealistic for CIS to decrease the rail occupancy in order to avoid high investment needs. And it's an interesting lever to optimize the rail network for Latin America. That's two possible interpretations. And secondly, the black lines represent interaction between parameters, and this interaction means that for those regions, we found that the modal shift tending to increase or decrease the investment needs depending on the rail occupancy that we want to reach. So basically, if I sum up, climate policies tend to reduce cumulative investment needs in transport infrastructures. And the main drivers are a reduction of transport activity and a much shift to low carbon modes as the non-motorized modes. It means that it could be a reorientation of investments from transport infrastructures, for example, to the energy sector, as we saw this morning with the presentation of Kiwan, where needs are really higher. The rail occupancy and the road building costs are influencing determinants in all regions. So what can we do to lower the road cost? Maybe a research development policy for low-cost technology. And we have to think about the availability of materials that influence the future cost for road construction. And about the optimization of rail occupancy, it depends on local conditions, on the goods that are transported on the network, and type or levers could be different as institutional, technical, for example. And for the mode shift, we want to do a mode shift from road to rail, for example, for different reasons, CO2 mitigation, the air quality on the congestion. And it's an interesting lever for investments, but only if we combine this with action on the rail occupancy. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting. So before I open the floor for questions, let me ask Shomik to give us a little bit of his views on what you have heard as these very different three angles or perspectives on policies that could influence the path to decarbonizing the transport sector, and particularly very interested in hearing from you on your views of the application of these policies, of some of these policies in some of the developing countries that we work on. No, so why are we not using more the railway sector in Latin America, for instance? That's a very good question. Is that feasible? What are the impediments if this is the way to go? So, Shomik.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. My congratulations to the three speakers, but also congratulations to whoever put together this session, because these three talks were actually very nicely complementary. I mean, so I'll start by just saying I took away a couple of very clear messages from it, which I really liked. First, the fact that left to itself, carbon pricing, which in many sectors has been seen as if not a panacea, close to one, has a very limited role in the realm of transport. It makes tactical differences. Not to underestimate the tactical difference from fossil fuel vehicles to electric or something else, but the structural issues are only in a very minor way impacted by carbon. But those structural issues, how space is organized, what investments are made, have a huge impact on transport carbon outcomes. I think that's the big message, that you can, what I heard from Vivien is that you can get locked into very high carbon investments very easily. And what I heard from Meriem is that once you do that, then carbon pricing is not going to rescue you. It's really structural changes in how space is organized and having a whole different kind of investment that you need. And really what I heard from James is that while there is a lot of excitement, not just in our communities, but in the general press about the prospect of electric, we can't forget that first, this is the third or fourth wave of hysteria about electric. And secondly, the analysis even now suggests that you need a very structured, policy-supported process to move even fleets where most of the costs can be passed on to passengers to electric. So we have to be careful about our expectations there. I'd like to perhaps reorganize my thoughts here, my comments on this in 2 or 3 different ways. First, what does this mean? I think the first thing it means for me, thinking about what it means for the bank and what it means for the structure of what we work on clean transport, is somehow all of these insights need to be reflected in the discussion for climate finance. I mean, that may or may not be important because at the moment, all the climate finance available can barely buy us a cup of coffee with or without lattes, right? So, but if there is a world of climate finance, then we have to figure out how to orient carbon finance around these insights. The key insights here are that technology is tactical, and most of the technology is being driven by kind of market factors, market evolution. The changes with and without carbon price were very minimal even for the technology. So it's not technology. It means that climate finance in transport, to the degree that it's going to have an impact, it needs to have an impact in places where, and I go back to a little climate finance vocabulary here, where the additionality is very limited, where there will be leakage, right? So we have a job in front of us. The whole structure of climate finance at the moment, which was driven very much by a supply-side energy world, would benefit very much from listening to the insights here and figure out how, if climate finance is going to be substantive, it's going to make a difference, how it could be structured to help steer countries and cities away from these high lock-in investments to low carbon pathways by creating the right incentives for reorganization of space and for public transport kinds of investments. And let me switch from there to this nice word that was used by Meriem on voluntary policies. And, you know, I like the word voluntary policies because for a policy to be voluntary, there needs to be a win outside of carbon. That's the reason to do it. And indeed, there are reasons. There are very good reasons to invest in better reorganization of space, so that we would call it, from a transport perspective, integrated land use transport development. And to invest in public transport, and to have demand management, mobility control policies. There are huge returns from a perspective of congestion and local pollution, so for productivity of urban spaces. But they don't happen, too often. They happen sometimes, but they don't happen too often. And perhaps what is interesting for all of us is to then take this insight and then go to the next level of where we need to work. The integrated land use doesn't happen for many reasons. There's a whole metropolitan governance agenda there that we have to figure out. And perhaps that's the first insight. You worked on China. I worked on China. I lived there for a few years. So these voluntary, even in a government system where it is quite easy to have top-down design, integration of land use and transport is very hard in China, in Chinese cities. Often it's hard because of the incentives of local governments. District governments, for instance. Each district government wants to become a Pudong, So there's a whole metropolitan governance agenda. There's a whole municipal finance agenda. Going back to Chinese cities, Chinese cities have been built, and unfortunately most of them are built out now, around a transport and land use investment plan that was driven, to those of you who know China would know this, around municipal finance constraints and opportunities created by the Chinese land tenure model. Okay, so but the land tenure model is uniquely Chinese, but the problems of municipal finance and the constraints of municipal finance driving the kinds of investments cities make is one that is well understood by the community as one that is critical to align if we're going to get these voluntary policies. And I would say on the modeling front, Julie and I have been struggling with some of these modeling questions. We don't have, perhaps because we don't have good examples, but we don't have a modeling framework to understand at any kind of granular level what will be the impacts of good integrated land use and transport and good public transport provision on motorization. We just don't have that. So as a modeling tool, having that whole framework of thinking, and those of you who are researchers working on these issues, perhaps will have something to do with that. That's something we want to talk about. And I'll make one final point and then turn it over. Technology. I think James's analysis showed very much that you have a positive benefit cost analysis for taxis. And if you take it, as Marcela suggested, from taxis to buses at electric, it probably is positive too. We are supporting projects in Latin America at the moment to look at the feasibility of electric bus transition in 5 big Latin American cities, Sao Paulo, Buenos Aires, Montevideo, Mexico. And it's not an economic analysis, is it? I mean, it's an economic analysis plus a financial analysis plus an institutional analysis. Because at the end of the day, the technology adoption and how to make technology sustainable is really a question that rests on those 3 pillars. And in many of the cities we work in, you work with very complex institutional and financial incentives, especially for public transport and for taxis. And any new technology adoption, if it's not very sensitive to them, runs risks both of failure on one side, or what could be even worse, limiting the utility of those options, which are really your key alternatives to private cars, which rolls back up to Meriem and Vivien's presentation. That's where the big benefits are, getting people out of cars. So our technology adoption, especially on public fleets, needs to be done so carefully. We are still learning. I'll just say that so far, all that we have found makes us be more careful about moving forward on testing new technologies like this on public transport, rather than be more optimistic. So I'll stop here.
Okay, so thank you, Shomik, very much. And now let me open the floor for questions. So please, maybe I'll ask if, are you going to move the microphone or, okay, good. So please go ahead. So we have a microphone over there, or we have a rotating microphone?
Thank you very much. My name is Rauf Tabbas, and I thank all of the speakers for presenting their valuable information. And I think I was there at the beginning in 2010 when we first started our global green growth, or our green economy scoping study. It was really the first country in the Middle East that had come up with that, and it was very strange for the government to even start thinking about something like this. But the reason for them was more because of the increase in the prices of fossil fuel, and that was the biggest push that we had. Now, that being said, now we're 2017, and we've gone a long way. We've done the Green Growth Strategy and Action Plan, in which we need more support in the implementation of that. But I think what we lack, and I'm coming back to what Mr. Shomik mentioned, those two variables are very weak in our part of the world, where we have the legislation, we have the policy, but what we lack is somewhere to go. The private sector is continuously coming up to me when I was at the government as a senior advisor there. Where do we buy this technology? Whether it's a taxi, charging station, a house, equipment, whatever technology it is, where do we go to find this? And the conventional is readily available in the market, and it's probably much cheaper because the economies of scale play into that as well. But the where to go is a very big question, and I don't know who can be addressing that. We need to have some type of portal or platform that would guide these entrepreneurs to that, and also the financing. We've heard a lot about the Jeff, but we don't see it on the ground. We don't see it anywhere. It's elusive. It's difficult to understand, and we haven't benefited from that as well. So maybe also there's somehow we need to look at some institution, and I think GGGI is also very well situated for that because of their connection. So the financing is a very important, non-existent in the third world that we need to look more at. Technology is there, money is there, but we don't know how to get to that. So maybe that could be shed some light on how can we achieve those 2 points. Thank you.
Okay. So my question is to Vivien and to Meriem. And I'd like to hear Shomik's view on this. One thing that struck me from your presentation, in particular, Meriem, is the extent to which, yes, of course, urban form policies make a difference, but it's not that huge of a difference, particularly if you think about how difficult they are to implement. And I think that's the point you were making, Shomik. So, when I see that, I start wondering to what extent realistically, and if we think about Mar Regant's point this morning about the political economy being so critical, and it came out in various other presentations this morning, that the first best is often not attainable. So if we think about that, and if you agree with my point that the benefits of changed urban forms are relatively modest compared to the huge costs and difficulties of implementing them, should we just be thinking back about really just regulation, different types of regulations, efficiency standards, banning certain types of vehicles, these kinds of things?
Maybe let me suggest that we have a first round of questions, and I will follow up with you, and then we can have those 3 questions to whoever in the panel has an answer to them. Okay, so let me ask for this last question, and then we hear from the experts.
Okay, Paul Eakins, University College London. Thanks for 3 fascinating presentations. I'd like to challenge this conclusion which Shomik drew out about the limitations of carbon pricing. One particular question is, you discovered the macroeconomic costs of your carbon prices when they're very high were high. That's what you said. I'm interested to know how you used the revenues from carbon pricing, because in all the model analyses I know, you only get high macroeconomic costs if you forget about the revenues or if you use them in a stupid way. And if you use the revenue sensibly, that's not the case. I think that the long-term elasticities of fuel pricing are much bigger. There's a well-known paper by Thomas Sterner that suggests that the fuel intensity in Europe is about half what it is in North America, largely because of the differences in fuel taxes in those two jurisdictions. And it would make all the difference to your benefit cost analysis in your taxes, because you've got a nice positive, benefit cost of 1.46, but that's only assuming a carbon price of, I think it was $50 a ton of carbon. Well, we know that doesn't exist, but it could exist if you were to tax road fuels at $50 a ton of carbon. And the unfortunate fact is that policymakers don't pay any attention in the political economy of it to externality pricing. I mean, we've got the paper from the IMF that suggests that fossil fuel subsidies are 5.3 trillion in 2015, I think it was. But the great majority of that is externality costs, and no one pays any attention to that. If you were to put a $50 a ton carbon price on road fuels, then that would be a real cost, and your benefit cost numbers would be real, and they would be felt by motorists, and they would start to bite in the political economy. So I think that's a very dangerous conclusion to suggest on the basis of the analyses that we've heard that therefore prices don't matter. And I'd like to challenge that quite strongly.
Okay, so Shomik, and then we will hear. But I don't think that the conclusion was that carbon pricing does not matter, no? But we'll hear from that.
Let me just, pardon me, it's always good to get this kind of question because it's good to be very careful with what you say. Carbon prices of $50 a ton, last time I calculated, are less than 10 cents a gallon. Okay, so those are not going to make the difference. The point about long-term price elasticity of fuel prices is well taken. You know, and I would say you have the nice way for others to think about it is that there are three levels of impact. Right in the short term, a lot of your travel may be inelastic. So if you have two cars, you may use the more fuel-efficient car more. In the medium term, it will affect what car you buy. And whether you decide, well, you may not have choice about whether you decide to buy a car, depending on where you live. But in the longer term, it will affect spatial development patterns. So the difference between the U.S. fuel prices and the European fuel prices, which are significantly more than $50 a ton of carbon, work their way through in these ways. People in the U.S. drive, on average, twice as much, and in cars that are about twice as fuel inefficient, and they use about 1.5 cars more per person at the same level of income as Europe. And it's because, in large part, because of fuel prices, but not carbon prices. I think that's the difference I'd make. So from a carbon, there are lots of good reasons to have the kind of policy you're saying. But those cannot be driven only by carbon. Perhaps that is the limitation of carbon. And I think the point is still there. The additionality of carbon externalities relative to the big kahuna of urban transport or transport in general. The additionality of carbon is limited. So it cannot be a carbon-driven exercise. And in response, perhaps, to what Marianne said, I think I would just say that we spend too much of our time talking about the carbon part of it. The additionality is just not there. I think the discussion needs to be how to address the bigger set of problems, which in the short and medium term dwarf the carbon problems for our cities. And if we go that way, then the solutions are, regulations are part of the solutions. But there are a set of solutions that align incentives enough, including with pricing, us towards the first best solutions of integrated land use transport and public transport. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
So anybody else?
I need it. Just to answer about this question of carbon pricing, limitation, I highlight what Maria said. My conclusion was not at all to say is that carbon pricing is not important. What I was saying is that carbon pricing regarding this transportation sector in particular is not enough, and it has to be complemented. And I absolutely agree with you about the question of revenue recycling, of the recycling of the revenues of this carbon pricing, and I didn't show the results in this study, but we have many studies that highlight the effect of different measures and different ways of recycling the carbon pricing that can really act strongly on the macroeconomic costs of the climate policy. But what we have shown is that the recycling of the revenues of the carbon price act mainly on the short to medium term, while and reduce the short-term costs when you smartly recycle the revenues, while the complementary measures on the transportation sector, such as the measures that I have implemented in these scenarios, act mostly on the longer run. So it can complement, but I definitely agree about the importance of the way you recycle the revenues of the carbon price when you implement such a policy. And also, I would like to come back to the fact that I also showed that the carbon pricing in the transportation sector induce significant effects on the energy efficiency of vehicles. So it's also to highlight that, it's an important instrument. And coming back also to Marianne's comment, how big is the effect of urban forms? It's a very interesting question, and I think it can be really interesting to, at least in this modeling exercise, to isolate this measure in order to quantify the effect of such a measure. But that said, I don't really agree with your point, because for me, a lot of cities are going to be constructed in the future, and perhaps having this in mind, although without quantification, but having this question, this impact of urban forms and urban sprawl, etc., in mind for developing economies where a lot of cities are going to be constructed, is something that is important, and it's not to be opposed, but to be complemented with technological solution and energy efficiency solution. So,
yes.
Let me just get back to Paul, your question about this carbon pricing in the benefit cost analysis. Yes, we didn't actually take into consideration, but one thing I want to share with you is the current price of the fossil fuel in Korea there's a lot of tax. LPG or the gasoline, the 50% of the current the retail price is tax. Of course, that's different from the carbon pricing, and there are many other things actually we could not consider in conducting benefit cost analysis. For example, we wanted to actually think about this. The benefits, the health benefits, externalities, from using more cleaner, fuel, electricity rather than LPG. For instance, PM 2.5 is probably the most damaging, air pollutant than any other, air pollutant, from the vehicle. But we couldn't actually take into the consideration because currently we don't have this formula emission factor for that the particular emitter. So if you actually consider all these the additional health externalities and then maintenance the cost savings and everything together, then my gut feeling is that we still have the quite positive the result from this cost-benefit analysis. But again, that's not the end of the story because there are so many other things we need to think about. The people are now recognizing that using electric vehicles is much more economical in terms of the operational cost, the fuel and maintenance. The biggest hurdle now, for me, is that people have this anxiety in terms of driving range and how many times they have to charge. So that is the main barrier to the deployment of electric vehicle, whether it's taxis or the other private vehicles. And Ralph, your question about this technology, I think the technology is there. When we did this analysis, we didn't actually consider this kind of the Tesla, very high-end electric vehicle. One specific electric vehicle taxi we consider is produced by the Luno, company, which is quite low-end. And, there are many companies in China actually produce this, the taxis and electric buses. So I think there's affordable technology is around. So your next question is, where was the finance? Currently GGGI is working with your government, the Jordan government, in the area of the charging infrastructure construction. And we are actually thinking about whether we could actually induce the private investment in the construction of the charging stations in Jordan. Now, the problem is, if we have the massive deployment of electric vehicles on the street in Jordan, then actually it's much easier, to get this investment from the private sector. But initially, the fleet is kind of small. So then charging infrastructure construction, will not be immediately beneficial for the private investor. So there's a dilemma: who should actually do the first action? Exactly. So as alternative, you mentioned the GEF, but I think we believe the GCF is I think one possible possible sources we can think about. We may they are recently actually reduced the the barrier of the project they will consider. So it's under $10 million they will consider. It's like a fast track project proposal. So I think there may be viable option we can think of.
Okay. So do you have one more question? Yes. Before we close, so that we close in time, we have 1 minute to make it not on.
Better?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Jan Siegmeier from the MCC again. I have one question regarding the models by Mrs. Hamdi-Cherif and Mr. Fisch. It's more a technical question. So did I understand it correctly that in your models, the policies are exogenous and then you simulate the outcomes, or do you actually do some kind of policy optimization within the models as well?
In the models, the policies are exogenous. But one important precision is that it's a simulation model, so it's not an optimization over time of cost.
We impose an exogenous trajectory. The climate objective is exogenous, but then the model calculates endogenously the carbon price necessary to reach this climate policy. So.
Another question?
No, it's fine. I just find it really a lack in the literature and research in general that it's hard to find comparisons or say methods on how to identify the ideal portfolio of instruments. So you have, in some cases, you have extreme cases like there's this policy and none of the other, or the other way around, like infrastructure or pricing or combinations. But for example, I still don't understand what's more efficient in furthering electric vehicle use, for example. Is it subsidies to buying them? Is it low electricity prices? Is it free parking? Is it infrastructure? And what combination of those measures is the most adequate in different circumstances, in urban circumstances, in developing countries, and so on? So combining instruments seems to be a task that's still difficult.
In the modeling world or in the real world?
Both.
It's more common than a question, so...
Well, yeah, maybe you have a different opinion. But
Yes, please.
Yeah, this is more a comment to the comment, actually. Because I think the way that you use these tools is most of the time the policies are exogenous. But for answering exactly the question that you have is you can actually compare an exogenous scenario that uses as an instrument a subsidy compared to another one which, for example, invests into recharging stations. And there are studies actually out there. There's a whole special issue out there in the transportation sector where different modeling teams, for example, have looked into behavioral change as well. So the real challenge in the modeling is not that they cannot represent policies. The real challenge is that particularly in the transport sector, we have a lot of heterogeneity, right? So carbon prices will work in the freight sector, but if you go to the private mobility, people are willing to pay, and it's about preferences. And then you have to think about policy levers that can help you to change that preference. And extending the range is one possibility. Having recharging station is another possibility. Making an electric vehicle as cool as a SUV is another possibility, right? So, and this is very difficult to get into the models often.
Okay, so any other question before we close and we conclude and maybe? Okay, so first let me thank you, our three panelists, for this very exciting discussion. I think that you all deserve a round of applause. And it seems to me that the main conclusion from this is that this is not a one size fits all. There are many different ways in which, policies that could contribute to this path towards decarbonization. And as you were saying, it depends a lot on where the baseline or where the country stands vis-a-vis the goals that they are trying to achieve. No, so we have talked and we have mentioned, and during the discussion, some of the key issues to consider: the financing, the institutions, the legislation. These are some of the things that will put the issues in action. So. I think that there's no one clear solution. There are many things to be done, and it is still a little bit of an uncertain path to reach this very ambitious goal of achieving decarbonizing the zero carbon in the transport sector in the future. But there are policies and there are evidence, and the research shows that there are measures that could support, and that we should be continue working on those. No. So, Meriem, do you have any?
Just that lunch is served outside, and I think we'll be the first ones there, so we can keep the crowds.
Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you.